Emily Carter and Raj Malhotra seemed like the perfect couple, an American bride and her Indian husband whose wedding promised a union of cultures. But just weeks later, their love story spiraled into a nightmare when a dark discovery turned their home in Texas into the scene of a shocking crime. The wedding of Emily Carter and Raj Malhotra became the talk of their small Texas suburb. For weeks, invitations had circulated, and curiosity grew about how such different worlds had come together. Emily was a young American woman raised in the South, admired for her independence and bright personality. Raj was an ambitious Indian immigrant who had built a promising career in technology, admired by his colleagues for his discipline and charm. Their meeting had been described as fate, two strangers from opposite backgrounds finding love across continents. Yet behind the joy, there were cracks no one dared to speak about openly. On the day of the ceremony, the atmosphere carried both excitement and unease. The venue was decorated with flowers and a mix of cultures, vibrant marigolds hanging alongside white roses, Indian drapes covering walls while traditional Western music played softly. Guests shifted in their seats, watching two families who barely understood one another sit together out of formality. Emily's relatives, dressed in gowns and suits, whispered about the rituals they didn't recognize, while Raj's family kept their expressions guarded, disapproving of the bride's choices but too polite to voice them. The air was heavy with unspoken tension. Emily walked down the aisle in a classic white gown, radiant and hopeful, her veil trailing behind her. To her, this was a symbol of unity, a bridge between two cultures. But Raj's parents, seated near the front, exchanged looks of disappointment. They had imagined their son's bride wearing a red sari, her hands adorned with henna, surrounded by prayers from their traditions. Instead, they watched what looked to them like a dismissal of their values. For Raj, torn between pleasing his family and honoring his new wife, the moment felt less like celebration and more like confrontation. When the vows were spoken, applause filled the hall, but not all smiles were genuine. Some relatives from Emily's side celebrated with tears of happiness, believing love had conquered all differences. Yet Raj's relatives remained reserved, whispering in hushed tones about the future. The dinner afterward became a study in contrast. Plates of Texas barbecue served alongside Indian curries, laughter from some corners of the room, silence in others. What should have been a night of harmony carried an edge of division. Neighbors who attended later recalled how unusual the event felt, like two stories forced together in the same book. The bride and groom smiled for photos, posed for videos, and danced as though everything was perfect. But for those who paid attention, the strain was undeniable. Beneath the music and lights, something darker lingered, and the wedding that seemed to unite two families instead planted the first seeds of a tragedy waiting to unfold. In the first few weeks of marriage, Emily believed life would eventually settle into something warm and familiar. She decorated their Texas home with framed photos from the wedding, arranged flowers on the dining table, and tried to bring small touches of comfort into their daily routine. Raj at first seemed attentive, taking her out for dinners and introducing her to colleagues as his new wife. But soon the energy shifted. The smiles he had once given her began to fade, replaced by a cold distance that she struggled to explain. He stayed longer at work, avoided casual conversations, and often left her feeling like a guest in her own home. It was during one of these late evenings that Raj made a discovery that changed everything. Searching through a drawer for insurance papers, he came across Emily's birth certificate tucked inside a folder. His eyes froze on a single word written in black ink. Her race was recorded as black. The truth was something Emily had never hidden, but she had never emphasized it either. For her, being black was part of her identity, but not something she believed needed to be defended or explained in a marriage. To Raj, however, it became a revelation he was unprepared for. Raised in a household where family honor meant everything, Raj had grown up with ideas that did not allow for such acceptance. In his mind, Emily was simply American, a label that carried no further weight. The certificate transformed his perception of her, and with it, the foundation of their relationship. What once had been moments of laughter now felt to him like betrayal. He began to replay every memory of their relationship, twisting it into something darker. He questioned her intentions, wondered if she had hidden the truth deliberately, and allowed resentment to take root in his thoughts. Emily sensed the change almost immediately. He stopped holding her hand in public, made excuses to avoid taking her to gatherings, and grew irritable over small things. When she asked what was wrong, he brushed her off with silence or sharp replies. The warmth that had once defined their marriage was gone, replaced by a quiet hostility that unsettled her deeply. Nights grew lonelier, and meals together felt like obligations rather than moments of love. What Emily could not yet see was how deeply this discovery had disturbed Raj. To him, her identity had become a stain he could not wash away. It was not just about her, but about how his family, his community, and his own pride would see the marriage. In his silence, dangerous thoughts began to grow, thoughts that would soon turn their home into a place of fear. The night of the assault began like any other evening, quiet and unremarkable. Outside, heavy clouds gathered, and soon the sound of rain pattered against the windows of their suburban home. Emily stayed inside, preparing a simple dinner, hoping the small gesture might ease the growing tension. Raj had been distant all week, barely speaking more than a few words, but she still believed that kindness could repair what was breaking between them. She placed plates on the table and lit a small candle, waiting for him to come home. When Raj finally walked through the door, soaked from the storm, his expression was unreadable. He didn't sit at the table or acknowledge the meal. Instead, he moved through the house with restless energy, pacing like a man trapped in his own mind. Emily watched carefully, her stomach tightening with unease. The silence was suffocating, every second stretched thin by unspoken anger. She tried to approach him, but her words only seemed to ignite the fury simmering beneath his calm exterior. What followed was sudden and brutal. His anger erupted without warning, shattering the fragile peace of the house. He overturned the dining chair, the candle crashing to the floor, and with it, the illusion of safety. Emily tried to retreat, but the storm outside was nothing compared to the violence that unfolded within those walls. Furniture splintered as he pushed her against it, glass shattered under the weight of his rage, and her cries were swallowed by the thunder rolling above. Emily fought to protect herself, but his strength and fury overwhelmed her. In the chaos, photographs from their wedding toppled from the shelves, the smiling faces in those pictures mocking the reality of what their marriage had become. Every corner of the home bore the marks of his assault, broken frames, torn fabric, and blood smeared across the floor. The life they had tried to build together collapsed in those moments of terror. When silence finally fell, it was not peace but exhaustion. Emily lay bruised and barely conscious on the cold floor, the rain outside masking her shallow breaths. Hours later, a friend who had grown worried by unanswered calls came to the house. The sight inside was horrifying. Shards of glass everywhere, overturned furniture, and Emily lying motionless. The scene told its own story, one of rage, fear, and a betrayal far deeper than anyone had imagined. When police arrived at the Malhotra home, they were greeted by a scene that immediately raised suspicion. Broken furniture lay scattered across the living room, shattered glass glistened on the floor, and bloodstains traced a path toward the kitchen. Emily was rushed to the hospital, her body covered in bruises, while Raj stood in the doorway, insisting it had all been a terrible accident. He claimed they had argued and she had fallen, but the officers knew right away that his story did not match the evidence before them. Detectives launched a full investigation, determined to uncover the truth. They interviewed neighbors who described hearing loud crashes and muffled cries during the storm. One neighbor recalled seeing lights flicker on and off through the window, followed by silence that lasted for hours. The picture that emerged was not of an accident, but of deliberate violence. The deeper investigators dug, the more troubling details surfaced. Raj's phone records revealed late, night conversations with his parents back in India. Messages showed increasing pressure from them, urging him to reconsider his marriage and warning that his wife's identity would bring shame to the family. These exchanges painted a picture of a man torn between cultural duty and personal choice, a conflict that spiraled into obsession. Inside Raj's office, detectives found a journal filled with disturbing notes. He had written about his resentment, scribbling passages about betrayal and dishonor. Some entries suggested that he believed Emily had tricked him, though there was no evidence she had ever hidden the truth about herself. His words were filled with anger, not just at her, but at himself for marrying someone his family would never accept. The journal became a key piece of evidence, exposing his mindset in the weeks leading up to the assault. Meanwhile, forensic specialists analyzed the crime scene. They noted blood patterns inconsistent with a fall and injuries that suggested repeated strikes rather than a single accident. The broken objects scattered around the room indicated a struggle that lasted far longer than Raj admitted. Every discovery further dismantled his version of events, leaving little room for doubt. For Emily, the days following the attack were a blur of hospital rooms and police interviews. Her voice was weak, but her account was clear and consistent. She described the growing tension, the fear she had felt, and the sudden eruption of violence. With her testimony and the overwhelming physical evidence, investigators began to piece together a chilling story, one of prejudice, control, and an eruption of rage that nearly cost her life. The trial of Raj Malhotra drew widespread attention, not only in Texas, but also across communities that followed the case from afar. The courtroom was filled each day with journalists, curious locals, and advocates for domestic violence victims. At the center of it all sat Emily, fragile but resolute, determined to confront the man who had nearly destroyed her life. Dressed modestly, her body still carrying faint scars from the assault, she became the voice that revealed the truth hidden behind the closed doors of their home. Prosecutors presented a timeline of events that left little room for doubt. They showed photographs of Emily's injuries, detailed medical reports, and the blood-stained remnants collected from the house. The jury winced as images of shattered glass and overturned furniture were displayed on the screen. Detectives took the stand to describe what they had uncovered: phone records filled with parental pressure, the journal entries filled with resentment, and forensic analysis that proved the assault was deliberate, not accidental. Each piece of evidence fit together like parts of a puzzle, building a narrative that was impossible to dismiss. The defense attempted to argue cultural misunderstanding, portraying Raj as a man overwhelmed by family expectations and societal pressures. They suggested that his reaction was one of emotional breakdown rather than cruelty, but the prosecution countered with force, reminding the jury that culture could never excuse violence. The law, they said, did not bend for shame, fear, or tradition. It was about accountability, and the facts pointed directly to guilt. Emily's testimony was the most powerful moment of the trial. Her voice shook at times, but her determination carried her words. She recounted the loneliness of those weeks after the wedding, the growing hostility, and the terrifying night of the assault. She described how she believed love could heal the distance, only to be met with rage. The courtroom fell silent as she spoke, many holding back tears. After weeks of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict, guilty of aggravated assault. The sentence was harsh, ensuring Raj would spend many years behind bars. His family, who had traveled for the trial, left quietly, their faces etched with shame. For Emily, it marked both an ending and a beginning. Though scarred, she survived. She chose to use her experience to speak out for others trapped in silence, becoming an advocate for victims of domestic violence. Her story, once hidden in shadows, became a beacon of resilience. The community, once shocked, now stood with her, reminded that love without acceptance can turn into the darkest kind of betrayal.